We interrupt the regular program schedule to bring you President Nixon's State of the Union message from the Capitol in Washington, D.C.
I will also ask for an appropriation of an extra $100 million to launch an intensive campaign to find a cure for cancer, and I will ask later for whatever additional funds can effectively be used. The time has come in America when the same kind of concentrated effort that split the atom and took man to the moon should be turned toward conquering this dread disease.
With 100 words, Richard Nixon effectively declares war on cancer. A national cancer program is birthed. Its director will report to the president himself, and it has appropriated $1.6 billion for its first 3 years alone. The American Cancer Society is instrumental in getting the bill passed and launches its own star-studded campaign.
Send a check to the American Cancer Society. It's great to be alive.
With a massive, coordinated effort, the United States, which little more than 2 years earlier had put a man on the moon, would someday soon conquer the most feared disease here at home.
Okay.
Heads back.
Turn your head around. Oh. There you go. Yeah. There you go.
There's something growing on my head. There's something growing on my head.
So Thomas has been here for 2 weeks, going on 3 weeks now. Right. And he's doing very well. Our home is in Tucson, and when Donna and I made the decision that there was going to be no radiation or chemo used on Thomas, the doctor decided to start hounding us. As a result, he told our attorney that because we had chosen not to speak to him directly and not to go with conventional therapy, that it left him no choice but to file charges against us with Child Protective Services for medical neglect, child abuse, and child neglect, which he did. It is the consent form to do radiation that we did at the University Medical Center. And when we initially did it, the doctor filled everything out, and then he went on to explain that possible side effects would be hair loss, skin redness, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, and loose BMs. And that's where he stopped. He said, go ahead and sign it. And I thought, well, gosh, if that's all we're dealing with, maybe it's not as bad as I thought. So I had signed it, and he left the room. About 10 minutes later, he came back and said, oh, by the way, Dad, I forgot. And he took it out of my hand and put it with the others and put the carbons back. He says, he'll also have fluid in the middle ear, hearing loss, hypothyroidism, spinal growth deficit, possible loss of IQ, memory loss, secondary tumors, hypopituitarism, low levels of hormones, and radiation necrosis, which is where the brain turns hard. And that's when I knew we were in trouble.
If your child was dying of cancer, wouldn't you want the best treatment available?
I want to know why my husband was put through 6 cycles of chemotherapy, and we were told up front it probably would have no effect.
The biggest cover-up in the cancer industry is that the industry is based on wealth, not health.
In this matter of life and death, some say the federal government is making matters worse, much worse.
And here you are pleading for the life of a person, and they're talking about the integrity of their bureaucratic process.
The couple's battle for alternative treatment is at the center of a national debate over medical freedom of choice.
These guys are part of a club, and believe me, that club has nothing to do with protecting the American people.
Why are people terrified when they hear the word cancer? Because they know it doesn't work. They know that what we're doing in this country and in the Western world doesn't work.
The image of cancer as a fearful disease is a well-deserved image, I think, in the American mind. And it's never been surpassed. It's always been number one in terms of the disease that the people in this country fear the most.
The word strikes terror in people's hearts, and we know from our current situation that when people are terrorized, when they're afraid, then they'll do almost anything to survive.
In September of '99, Thomas was experiencing flu-like symptoms. And after about 3 weeks, I had said to Donna, this doesn't make sense. So I had called my personal physician, and she took a look in one of his eyes with a flashlight, and she said he needs to see his doctor right now. Donna comes out and screams my name and then drops to the ground. She said, our boy is dying.
Since the war on cancer began in 1971, more than 14,800,000 Americans have died from some form of the disease. 1,500 die every day. That's 565,000 men, women, and children in 2009 alone. More people will die from cancer in this country in the next 3 years than all the American soldiers who died fighting since the American Revolution.
From 1920 to the present time, we have made little or no progress in the treatment of adult cancers. So a person who gets prostate cancer or breast cancer today will live as long as a person who got it in 1920. No big change. With all the radiation therapy that we began in the 10s and 20s, combination chemotherapy in the 60s, immunotherapy that began in the 70s, PET scans, MRI scans, you name it, billions and billions and billions of research dollars that we've thrown into this whole area of cancer research and treatment, little or no significant progress in the treatment of adult cancers.
In the early 1900s, pneumonia was the #1 cause of death. People were terrified of pneumonia because even though some survived, most did not. Now, when we have cancer as the #1 cause of death, because we treat pneumonia now successfully with antibiotics, and no one's afraid of pneumonia. But with cancer, the treatment we have, the majority, overwhelming majority, die. Nothing we've done in a century has substantially reduced the death rate of various cancers relative to the population density. We are a total failure.
The question is, there are so many different ways to pursue this, and no one knows what the right one is. So we try lots of things, and anytime human beings try lots of things, a lot of them are not going to work, but some of them will. And we've had some successes. For example, testicular cancer, what Lance Armstrong had. When I was training as a medical student and an intern, that was uniformly fatal. Now, many of those men are long-term survivors. So in certain cases, lymphomas, Hodgkin's disease, testicular cancer, there have been major breakthroughs that have made huge differences to people's lives. Unfortunately, the more common cancers, colon cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, those cancers are not as susceptible to our treatments at this point.
Cancer itself is a very complex disease. There are more than 200 different types of diseases that all come under the rubric cancer. Malignant, out of control cell growth, that's what cancer is. And there are many different forms of it, unfortunately.
Cancer, in its various forms, has confounded humanity for centuries. An Egyptian papyrus from 1550 BC describes cancer as a tumor against the gods for which there's no cure. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, who lives in 400 BC, notices a tumor's nasty ability to spread out as if it has tentacles and names the disease carcinoma, the Greek word for crab. But he has no idea how to treat it. More than 2,000 years later, in 1884, William Halsted, a surgeon at Johns Hopkins, performs the first radical mastectomy.
But he thought that cancer cells just spread by sort of marching in a straight line, and therefore if you had a breast cancer here, then you had to remove all the tissue around it, and not thinking that cancer cells could get in the blood, circulate around. And the radical mastectomy stuck around for 75 years, even though it was based on biology that was defective. Dr. Halsted, probably if he had lived long enough, would have changed it, but he didn't.
It then ushered in the paradigm that we need to search and destroy cancer cells. So that's the paradigm that we've lived with for over 100 years. Now, we add to that chemotherapy, we add to that radiation therapy with the intent of killing the cancer cell.
They kept telling me, you're a prime candidate, it's all contained, we'll just take out the lung and, But I just kind of like my lung. I didn't want to lose it.
In March 2007, 70-year-old Gloria Labarge is diagnosed with mesothelioma, a form of cancer in which malignant cells are found in the protective sac that covers most of the body's internal organs. To the best of her knowledge, she has never been exposed to asbestos, the most common cause of the disease. Prognosis for survival, 8 to 18 months.
After taking the lung out, they would do chemo and radiation just to make sure that they got it all, but they never know whether they've gotten it all or not. That's the scary part. You go through all of that, and you never know. You absolutely never know.
Conventional medicine doesn't know how to treat cancer. They treat cancer at the symptoms of it. They don't treat the underlying condition of it. Doctors will look at the lump or the bump, and they say, there is the cancer. That's defined as the cancer. And so then they will treat the lump or the bump. They will do whatever they can to get it to go away. They will burn it away, they will cut it out, or they'll try to poison it. And if they can succeed in getting rid of that lump or bump, then they say, aha, we got rid of the cancer.
Thomas is laying in bed now because they're done looking at him. And the doctor walks in and said, Mr. and Mrs. Navarro, your son has a brain tumor. It's always fatal. We're going to be doing surgery tomorrow morning. And turned around and left the room.
On September 19th, 1999, Thomas undergoes brain surgery. The biopsy of his tumor leads to a diagnosis of medulloblastoma cancer. Jim and Donna are told that without immediate treatment, the condition will recur in 9 months.
Right away, I did not want to do chemotherapy and radiation. I knew what would happen to Thomas once he had chemo and radiation. His quality of life would be non-existent. I mean, with radiation alone, if you have an average child with an average IQ of 100, they lose 4 IQ points per year accumulative. So in 5 years, you have a mentally handicapped child. And then you have all the other side effects because there's radiation to the brain. You have hypopituitarism, hypothyroidism, spinal growth deficit, loss of hearing, blindness. Why would you want to put a 4-year-old child through that and then in 5 to 10 years have a recurrent cancer? So I was dead against it.
First specific evidence that radiation is carcinogenic dates back to the 90s. Carcinomas of the hands and other radiation injuries commonly afflicted the operators of unshielded X-ray machines. The extreme penetrability of hard X-rays and gamma rays makes them carcinogenic to all parts of the body. Whatever the kind of radiation, its effects depend upon the dosage, the length of exposure, and the individual's susceptibility to cancer.
Well, you see, radiation is the treatment which is over 100 years old. And obviously, it was created at the time when the knowledge of cancer was just minimal, which was microscopic. And obviously, radiation is causing a lot of destruction in the body. Everybody knows about it. For majority of patients, the medical profession thought that this was irrelevant because they realized that this patient will be dead anyway in another 2 or 3 years, or maybe even a year later. So this means that chronic adverse reaction from radiation didn't matter because this patient would not live long enough.
We had surgery and we had radiotherapy, but we had very little beyond that until about the 1960s. And it was realized around that time that the reason why surgery and radiotherapy were not succeeding is that there were cells that got out of the surgical field and the radiation field and circulated around, and eventually these metastases killed patients, and so then you needed something else, chemotherapy.
Ironically, it's an event in World War II that gives rise to the premier weapon in the war on cancer. On December 2nd, 1943, the German Luftwaffe launched a devastating air raid on the Allied navies stationed in Bari, Italy. Among the U.S. vessels destroyed is the John Harvey, which carries a secret cargo of 2,000 mustard gas bombs. Several hundred of the attack's survivors are exposed to the poison gas, and what doctors discover in treating them is startling.
Their blood counts just disappeared. They died from bone marrow failure. And lymph nodes, in autopsies, you couldn't even find them. And so he thought that maybe these would work against cancers if those organs led to the development of nitrogen mustard.
The first trials to see whether this would work were done, of course, in animals. Dr. Gilman, who is really one of the founders of toxicology and pharmacology, selected this one mouse that had a huge tumor and injected it with poison gas equivalent and saw that the tumor shrank and the mouse was able to move and look hardy. Then they stopped giving it the poison gas and the tumor came back. They gave the poison gas again and the mouse recovered again. And they thought, this is amazing. Now, in fact, he reports in his memoirs that subsequently they did the same work with other mice and they never got as good a result. So if they'd picked the wrong mouse in the first place, we might never have been embarked on using chemotherapy in this way.
In the late 1960s, a team led by Vincent DeVita pioneers the use of combination chemotherapies to successfully treat Hodgkin's disease. Similar treatments are used to dramatically reduce the mortality of certain childhood leukemias.
And when that happened, the people who were health advocates thought that we had reached a point where some massive effort would now allow us to go over the top and cure the majority of patients with cancer.
We would not want to raise false hopes by simply the signing of an act. But we can say this, that for those who have cancer and who are looking for success in this field, they at least can have the assurance that everything that can be done by government, everything that can be done by voluntary agencies in this great, powerful, rich country now will be done.
And so the war on cancer begins. And with it comes an explosion in the use of chemotherapy.
Overwhelming evidence of a new weapon against a cancer. Combining chemotherapy with radiation increases survival by as much as 50%.
Lilly's drug Alimta, when taken with chemo, may extend the lives.
Tamoxifen, newly approved by the FDA to reduce breast cancer risk by as much as 50%.
When I was a drug chemist, one of my first jobs was to design a tamoxifen derivative. Anytime you have to design a derivative of an existing drug, that means there's something wrong with the drug. And what we found in the lab was that tamoxifen was actually causing cancer. The chemists that I was working with, my superiors, etc., just said, it's $1 billion industry and tamoxifen's not coming off the market. And if we can design a safer derivative, great. But if we can't, tamoxifen is going to remain on the market.
Multiple studies in the 1990s show that while tamoxifen reduces the incidence of breast cancer, it more than doubles the occurrence of uterine cancer.
Doctors often tell women, well, even if you get uterine cancer, we'll be on top of it, and that just requires a simple little hysterectomy anyway. But it's only used for 5 years. Why? And that's because after 5 years, the risk increases of developing breast cancer caused by the tamoxifen.
Tamoxifen has generated more than $6 billion in sales for its maker, AstraZeneca, and is part of an industry worth some $70 billion a year.
All right, but I'll take this out. Okay.
One shot is $7,500, and a pill is one pill $300. The stem cell transplant I went through, combined with the radiation, combined with all the chemotherapy prior to that, we understand was over $1 million.
Ray Lamy is diagnosed with bladder cancer in 1980 at the age of 36. Since then, he has suffered through battles with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, indolymphoma, and now aggressive lymphoma.
I just read in the paper the other day the average cancer patient between the time they're diagnosed and the time that they die is $350,000 in medical expenses. So that's big business. And it is big business.
Heavy trading today in the biopharma sector after thousands of stock-moving and potentially treatment-changing cancer drug studies came out overnight.
Bristol wants Imclone primarily for its blockbuster cancer drug Erbitux, which racked up nearly $425 million in sales in the last quarter.
Our cancer center was the first in the region to offer Novalis shape beam robotic radiation therapy.
They're also testing this drug in combination with other cancer drugs for other tumors as well. So it's about expanding the use of Erbitux to make it an even bigger blockbuster than it already is.
You have doctors spending 3 years learning how to do chemotherapy and radiation. You have specialist radio-oncology. You have cancer surgeons. You have cancer oncology. So you have this entire industry built on the paradigm of purging the body. Even though we find that that doesn't work, that industry is not going to just pack up and go away.
Once we knew what the oncologists and the radiologists wanted, the treatment that they wanted for Thomas, we sat down and we made the decision that we were not going to do that. And then, of course, we had opposition with the doctors. Right away, we were medical neglect. And it's like, we're not neglecting our child. We just want the best for our child.
You know that this poison they're putting in you can cause other tumors, can cause other cancers. And what is it doing to your body? I mean, it's your body's taking a beating. Very difficult. The first time I got chemotherapy, it's hard. You know, it's hard.
We are suffering now from the fact that we started out on the wrong foot, we stayed on the wrong foot for 100 years, and we are paying the price.
Chemotherapy and radiation therapy are nonspecific. They kill anything in its way. The reason why people lose their hair, the reason why people get nauseated and vomit is because chemotherapy kills any actively dividing cell, so irrespective of normal or not.
And if you think of it, it's like going in and doing an air raid, dropping bombs on a village to get rid of a pocket of rebels that are housed in a small area.
If you contract almost any cancer, you're likely to die at about the same time, whether you take chemo agents or not. Now, there are some exceptions, but by and large, that is the rule. And despite that, the FDA, the oncologists in the world, cancer societies, all favor reliance upon this treatment modality that's brutal, and then they die at roughly the same time they would have had they done nothing, and they would have felt a lot better having done nothing.
There she is, and she had the baby on the other
One day I was actually at work having lunch with a close colleague, and Patty called me up and said she was very concerned, and I even joked that you had cancer throughout your body.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
1994.
You know, it turned out to be our worst nightmare come true. So she had the diagnosis in September. It was actually September 4th of 2004.
After Patty Bernhardt is diagnosed with ovarian cancer, she undergoes chemotherapy every month for the next 3 years and would try every drug made available to her: cisplatin, Taxol, Taxotere, Gemzar.
You know, when we would talk about the treatments with our oncologist and the pain that the treatments actually caused and the resulting sickness afterwards, there was no pain relief, no painkiller, no mind-altering substance that could even take away the pain. And when we went to our doctor and said, this is unbelievable how much this hurts her, he said, well, I'm showering your organs with poison. It's going to hurt.
With a person on chemotherapy, the idea is, well, we're going to kill the cancer cells just before we kill the patient. And if we can draw that fine line, then we're successful. So in my view, this is primitive medicine. I think someday people will look back at this period of history and they'll laugh at it, just the way we look back at the way they used to bleed patients.
Whoa, you're falling off. Yeah,
That one? The oncologist was like, well, I can understand why you wouldn't want to do radiation, but you have to do chemotherapy.
And he'd already told us chemotherapy won't work.
Do it again.
Do it again?
Yeah. And we were telling we wanted to get a second opinion. And they're like, it doesn't matter how many second opinions you get, whether it's from California to New York, all the treatments are going to be the same. We all run off the same game plan. And it's like, that's ridiculous. There's got to be different therapies out there.
Once again,
how you doing?
Welcome to Houston.
Thank you. Thank you.
So how's it going? You look like you're growing again, okay?
Pretty good.
Yeah, right.
Feeling good.
Looks like you maintained your weight very well. Are you exercising?
Yes. Yep.
So what do you do?
I work out, do weights, do cardio.
I see. Okay.
Try to go to some classes as well.
Everything's going very well. Well, it's almost 20 years.
Yeah.
It's a long time. Yes. You don't have any signs, any symptoms of the tumor?
In 1985, 4-year-old Paul Michaels is diagnosed with a cancerous brain tumor the size of a tennis ball. After surgery, Paul's mother questions their doctor about the side effects of radiation.
We were sitting at a table like this, and he said, regardless what you do, radiation or not, he's gonna die.
And he was 4, but he wasn't stupid. He was a bright little 4-year-old. And I thought, oh God, please make him not have heard that. And that night when I put him to bed, Paul said to me, Mom, if I die, will you go with me? And I told him I would, and I think I would have.
In 1987, Mary Kay brings Paul to the Brzezinski Clinic in Houston, Texas. And 6 years later, the boy who was supposed to be dead by age 9 is cancer-free and the subject of a CBS News special.
That is the same tumor we just saw in
That's
the original?
correct, yes.
This tiny dot?
Yes.
Do you have any question in your mind that he saved your life?
I know he did.
Today, Paul Michaels is a 29-year-old nursing student who is, by all appearances, cured of cancer. He is one of thousands of patients who have been treated by renowned Polish-born doctor Stanislaw Brzezinski, who flees communist Eastern Europe for the United States in 1970 and does postdoctoral work at Baylor University before opening his own cancer clinic in Houston, Texas. It is here that he pioneers anti-neoplastons. These non-toxic peptides and amino acid derivatives are synthesized to act like molecular switches, turning on tumor-suppressant genes and turning off the oncogenes responsible for cancer growth. In the early 1980s, under the watchful eye of the FDA, Brzezinski and his treatment are confined to the state of Texas, and patients who are told that they have no good options with traditional therapies flock to his clinic.
A bone marrow transplant was prescribed for me, and it didn't offer me a cure at all. And in fact, they were going to bring me as close to death as possible and then rescue me.
The doctor who pioneered this technique said you will receive as much radiation as people that were less than 1 mile from ground zero at Hiroshima.
And Dr. Brzezinski said to me, I think I can help you. 3 weeks after going on the IV, it disappeared. Totally gone. It was a miracle. And every CAT scan that I had from starting Dr. Brzezinski's treatment showed reduction.
But in 1995, Mary Jo Siegel, Paul Michaels, and hundreds of other patients being treated by Brzezinski are told that they may no longer be able to use anti-neoplastons. While one branch of the FDA is approving Brzezinski for phase 2 clinical trials, another is targeting him for prosecution.
They were out to destroy him. They were serious about this. The U.S. attorney was going to put him away for life. I mean, for 300 years.
It just always amazed me that the FDA could spend so much time doing something like this that's so, it's wrong. It's just morally wrong.
FDA, go away! FDA, go away! FDA, go away! Let us live another day!
We met with senators, we met with, different legislative bodies, committees, subcommittees, Commerce Committee.
Dr. Brzezinski saved my life, and for that, he is facing 300 years in a federal penitentiary.
All of them very supportive, but all feeling very helpless about anything that they could do with the FDA.
I just remember what Paul said. Do you remember what you said?
No. Huh.
He said, I feel like I'm in a war against cancer and the government is taking away the only weapon I have. And it was like, that.
There's virtually no one the FDA has to account to. Congress performs an abysmal job of oversight. They might hold hearings, chastise the FDA commissioner, but there's no consequence for bad acts by the FDA commissioner. The courts rarely second-guess the judgment of the agency. They have broadly deferential standards of review, and the American people are left helpless.
You don't know their names. They don't run for election. They don't change with administrations. They're not Democrats. They're not Republicans. They are professional bureaucrats that hold all the power.
When the FDA begins in the late 19th century as a division within the Department of Agriculture, it has no regulatory power and is so small that its first chief, a flamboyant chemist named Harvey Washington Wiley, sometimes takes drugs himself to see if they make him sick and files reports with his findings. The department's power grows steadily, however, and by the 1930s, the freshly named Food and Drug Administration is regulating the safety and marketing of all new drugs in the U.S. Many leading drug companies oppose the oversight.
But finally, the drug industry began to view regulation as a way to reduce competition. But how did that transition take place? Well, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women in Europe, and that it resulted in rather extraordinary deformities. This horrified the world, and an opportunity was seized at that point by the proponents of greater drug regulation.
The fear of a thalidomide tragedy in the U.S. leads to the signing in 1962 of the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, and with it, the powers of the FDA are revolutionized. Now, in addition to proving that their products are safe, drug manufacturers are required to supply to the FDA substantial evidence that the drugs are effective as well.
You read the food and drug laws, they're very flexible. The FDA's interpretation of those rules are very rigid.
As FDA started adopting regulations to determine what constituted substantial evidence to approve a drug and started to create all these Byzantine requirements, they were creating this infrastructure to protect incumbent drug companies from competition. The largest players had the money to pay for the process. New entrants did not.
This means that immediately small pharmaceutical companies were eliminated. Inventors like Louis Pasteur disappeared completely because the doctors were severely punished by trying to use something innovative.
Aspirin, for example, would not be approved today by the Food and Drug Administration because it caused adenomas in mice in the lungs. I would like to loosen up on the regulations in ways that allow cancer centers, for example, to develop drugs without having to go back to the FDA every time you sneeze.
And what is the upshot of that? The upshot of that is it costs on average about $1.6 billion for a single drug to be approved in the United States. That game can only be played by the largest monopolies on earth. So if you invent a drug, you discover an agent that has therapeutic utility, and you're in the scientific community out there, you can largely kiss that drug goodbye.
We have an extraordinary story for you of a cancer doctor whose patients say
He's performing miracles, but the government wants to close him down.
Friday, the Food and Drug Administration raided the doctor's office, seizing patients' files and other documents.
Initially, I was not of interest to FDA because I think pharmaceutical companies were not interested in what I had. I think the biggest problem began when pharmaceutical companies, when the government realized that I have something very valuable, which can get rid of cancer in a number of people, and the cancer which was incurable by any other means.
The Texas state attorney, at the behest of the FDA, wants to strip Brzezinski of his medical license and shut down his clinic.
We are here today because Dr. Brzezinski has, for 16 years, been unwilling or unable to comply with the requirements of the law.
Testifying at the pretrial hearing is Georgetown University doctor Nicholas Patronis, who reviewed 7 of Brzezinski's cases for the National Cancer Institute. He testifies that anti-neoplastons are the most effective treatment for brain tumors I have ever seen.
Respondent calls MM.
If my son goes off the treatment, there's no doubt in my mind that his tumor would grow and that he would die.
The tumors will grow, they will lose the vision, they will be paralyzed, and they will die because there's nothing in the world which can be used to save these patients' life.
You intend to continue doing just what you've been doing until somebody is able to stop you. Is that not true?
I'm going to do what the law will allow me to do, Mr. Helcom. I do whatever is necessary to bring my medicines to approval in the United States and everywhere in the world and bring you to justice for causing the deaths of 200 patients. And they will come back here to haunt you until we are dead.
Are you threatening me, Dr. Brzezinski?
I'm not threatening you, but that's what's going to happen in the future.
Well, I think that's something that remains to be seen.
At the trial, several months later, the FDA brings 75 counts against Dr. Brzezinski. Not one of them is related to the safety or efficacy of anti-neoplastons.
The charges were essentially shipping a medicine across state lines. Give me a break. I mean, that's a capital crime? It's ridiculous. Absolutely, and it wasn't even true. But this is a very, very tight monopoly.
Despite spending 13 years and an estimated $8 million prosecuting him, Brzezinski is acquitted of all charges, with the jury foreman stating, "I think this was a government witch hunt. I couldn't find any victims."
Hey! Oh, I'm so happy! Oh, God!
Patients like Mary Jo Siegel and Paul Michaels are permitted to stay on anti-neoplaston treatments. But as former FDA Chief Counsel Peter Barton Hutt has said, if you beat the FDA in court, you have an angry FDA that is willing to slit your throat. So while the government cannot strip Dr. Brzezinski of his medical license, they can dramatically change the rules governing admittance to his clinic.
In a cramped Houston hotel room, 4-year-old Thomas Navarro is dying of brain cancer, and his desperate parents find themselves caught up in a larger fight between a controversial Houston doctor and the federal government.
You researched other families that had boys that had medulloblastoma, that had not gone through chemo and radiation, and sought out Dr. Brzezinski and was treated by them. How come you didn't get in? And my answer is always this. Well, they got in before the FDA got involved. And once the FDA started seeing that he was having success with treating cancer, then they were like, okay, we got to set up all these protocols for all these different cancers so we can limit him what he can do. And then once the patient is terminally ill, no hope, then we'll give him the patient to see what he can do then. And of course, they're setting him up to fail.
The American Cancer Society does the Navarros no favors by placing anti-neoplastons on the unproven methods list. This compendium is considered a blacklist by many in the medical establishment. No insurance company will cover treatments listed here, and it is used to brand Dr. Brzezinski as a quack.
The American Cancer Society should have been funding Brzezinski. I mean, his data was clearly provocative, but they got on board to put him out of business.
You're the American Cancer Society. Don't you want cancer to be prevented in America? Instead, they end up on the side of the government, arguing that the information should be censored, suppressed, never allowed to reach the American consumer. Well, that speaks volumes, I think. And then you have to ask yourself, who does the American Cancer Society represent? Well, the answer with all nonprofit organizations is defined by where their financial support comes from.
The American Cancer Society is one of the world's wealthiest nonprofit organizations. It has assets including land, cars, and cash totaling more than $2 billion. In order to finance this operation, the ACS has established a long history of partnerships with deep-pocketed corporations.
So mild that you're bound to agree. That camel suit.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor? Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine, in all parts of the country, were asked that question. What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor? The brand named most was Camel. Yes, surveys show more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Smoke Camels, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
I was stunned to learn that the first director of the American Cancer Society, Clarence Cook Little, resigned from that position in 1954 to become the scientific director of the Tobacco Industry Research Council. The Cancer Society itself had board members at the time who worked hand in glove with the tobacco industry advertising firms, and they were running the Cancer Society like a massive advertising campaign, a tradition that hasn't changed in that regard.
We're raising $27,000 for the River on Wall.
Breast Cancer Awareness Month was actually initiated by the company that makes tamoxifen. The devices for mammograms are made by General Electric, and General Electric is in a relationship with the people behind Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So there's a huge, huge industry that has been invested in breast cancer. Although the goal is noble, to me it's obscene that these companies are using the symbol of the pink ribbon for commercial purposes only. Very few dollars ever make it to really help women.
This is a business. American Cancer Society is a business of getting donations. And what I say to people when they give money to these agencies, you are perpetuating the failure. Because if the American Cancer Society actually found a cure for cancer, in their bylaws, it said they must disband.
If cancer were really cured, really tomorrow, would that put the ACS out of business? I don't know. In a funny way, the entire healthcare system, the entire system of research in healthcare is based on a model where we're trying to put ourselves out of business. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's fine. I don't think it's likely to happen in my lifetime anyway.
The problem with the American Cancer Society is that I think they are an impediment to advances in cancer therapy.
In 1928, a Greek-American researcher named George Papanikolaou, using funding from the American Cancer Society, shows that you can take a few cells from the opening of the cervix, swab them, and determine under a microscope whether cancer has already occurred or is about to occur. If caught early enough, the cancer can be prevented, but the Papanikolaou test is not put to use.
There were fights going on between pathologists and surgeons about whether it was ever proper for a test to be done in a doctor's office and then sent outside for someone else to read.
Though originally funded by the ACS, the Society changes course and aligns itself with physicians and surgeons who argue that the test is a threat to the practice of medicine. For 29 years, the low-cost test is kept under wraps while women are treated with high-dose radiation or have their cervixes surgically removed.
Prior to the pap smear being used, women were dying at very high rates of cervix cancer. Once the pap smear was finally put into place, not until the 1960s, deaths and cases of cervix cancer fell like a rocket, unbelievably.
Today, the pap smear is performed by physicians and technicians alike. It has reduced the incidence of cervix cancer by 40%. And ironically, the ACS touts its introduction as proof of its pivotal role in the treatment of cancer.
If you look at the history of cancer therapeutics, it's like Gettysburg. It's just scattered with bodies of all the people who have tried to bring effective new treatments to the market and have been shot down.
Throughout the century, promising cures and therapies are met harshly by the AMA, the FDA, and the ACS. Scientists, including the likes of Nobel laureates Linus Pauling and Otto Warburg, are considered traitorous and their work labeled as quackery. In the 1950s, Benedict Fitzgerald, special counsel for the Interstate Commerce Committee, is enlisted to investigate allegations of conspiracy on the part of the medical establishment. In 1953, Fitzgerald's report is submitted to the United States Senate, stating, "My investigation to date should convince this committee that a conspiracy does exist. Public and private funds have been thrown around like confetti at a county fair to close up and destroy clinics, hospitals, and scientific research labs which do not conform to the viewpoint of medical associations." The report is buried, Fitzgerald reassigned, and today the battle to suppress innovation rages on.
Canadian research team has come up with DCA. They believe it's a cheap and simple drug that kills almost all cancers. You heard that right. The real story is you can't have it. Not because it's unsafe, but because your blood's going to shoot out of your eyes because it doesn't make any money.
DCA isn't owned by any pharmaceutical company. There's no patent on it. So on one hand, it could become a very inexpensive new treatment for cancer. On the other, drug companies won't be interested in funding studies for a drug that won't make them a profit.
And in the U.S., the FDA has shut down all sites selling the drug.
How do you take something that costs pennies a day and fit it into a system that at the end of the process is supposed to generate a drug that's going to make $2 or $4 billion a year for you? Can't be done.
Back in the early to mid 80s, I was in the laboratory and we worked on an immune therapy, and I thought this would be very applicable for children with bone cancer that spreads to the lungs.
Because the cancer Dr. Kleinerman is investigating only affects 1,000 children a year, no pharmaceutical company will finance the trials necessary to get FDA approval. But through a grant, the trials are designed and funded. The results are remarkable, and a breakthrough cure seems imminent.
Well, the FDA, in looking at the design, said, we don't like the design, and we don't think it should have been designed this way. But, okay, we did it, and the data's there, and the data's been submitted for publications to one of the top oncology journals. But it doesn't look like it's going to be accepted as the pivotal trial to get licensing. This is children's lives. As we argue back and forth between what should be done, our patients are losing valuable time they don't have.
Dr. Kleinerman's clinical trials in the late 80s and early 90s were funded through a grant from the NCI. She was one of the fortunate researchers to get a piece of the Institute's nearly $4 billion annual budget. The scientists at the University of Alberta haven't been so lucky.
If you have an idea that's way off the map, and you put it in a grant and say, I want to test this, they'll throw it away.
There's a tendency for the people at the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, the AMA, the whole works, to not be that interested in trying to look at possible changes in our healthcare system in terms of better treatments for disease.
The problem isn't quack, quack, quack. The core problem is money. The core problem is patents. The core problem is who is going to control this cure or this treatment at the end of the day. And if it isn't the quote-unquote right people, if it isn't the big corporations, it just isn't going to happen.
Not only does this paradigm not work and people suffer and die as they have the entire century, but this paradigm blocks out true discoveries. This paradigm persecutes those who actually can help.
Today I got a call from a father named Thomas Navarro, and the FDA has refused to allow him to do what he thinks is best for his son, and they placed the whole matter on clinical hold while his son dies. I've written a letter to Donna Shalala, the key to which is the statement, it should be the right of every responsible American citizen to seek the medical care of their choice without government bureaucracies standing in the way.
And one of the things we were exposing was the fact that the FDA has never approved the use of radiation or chemo for using on children. The fact that if you read the pharmaceutical inserts on the chemotherapies, that it says right on there from the manufacturer, has not been proven safe or effective for pediatric application. So my question is, if the guys that make it say, gosh, we don't know if it works and we don't know if it's safe, but we'll put you in prison if you don't do it, what's that all about? It's insane.
Now the parents are getting some support from unlikely sources. Two of the men who are running against each other for president.
Enter the politicians. First Republican Alan Keyes, now Texas Governor George W. Bush, urging the FDA to reconsider, arguing it's the family's choice, not the federal government's.
Parents are absolutely worried to death about radiation and what it means to the boy, and I would hope the FDA would reconsider.
Even though we were out there pushing our opinion and our right, the FDA is so powerful, they still were standing up and saying no.
Good morning, Dr. Henney. My name is Jim Navarro, and you're probably very aware of who I am. I'd like to know, first of all, why, as a parent, I don't have the right to treat my child. For 5.5 months, we've been here in a hotel, waiting, still challenging the decision. Why can't you allow my son an opportunity to a non-lethal, non-toxic modality first?
I think that I would say to you that the kind of therapy that is being offered in traditional settings that has a proven efficacy is what the physicians that you saw in Arizona and over at the MD Anderson in Houston and many oncologists who treat this disease in this country would be recommending to you. And it's for that reason, because there is standard therapy available, that we are saying that is what should be done before experimental therapy is tried.
Standard of care simply means we've used this for decades unopposed and no one's opposed us because we've imprisoned them. And anyone that dares speak against us, we throw in jail.
And they will also threaten to take all your children away and then bargain with you and say, okay, we will give you back these other children if you just let us have this one and treat them. And what are you supposed to do as a parent?
In April of 2000, Jim and Donna take Thomas and his brother Patrick to Mexico in an effort to avoid persecution, stall for time to get into the Brzezinski clinic, and try an alternative, non-toxic therapy.
Realistically, for the FDA to allow it, I don't know that they will allow it. I think what it's going to take is a congressional order to get them to stand down. It's not about whether or not they want to allow it, because they don't. It flies in the face of what they're doing. It disrupts their covenant with the pharmaceutical companies, so they're not going to go for it.
You have right to choose in the entire commercial market except for medicine. And it's interesting. Your right to choose in cancer is truncated the most. You'll find that when conventional medicine is not working, that is the therapy that receives the most attention and the most protection by the FDA and the AMA and the other conventional guys. You know, people don't go to Mexico to get treatment for a broken leg.
We've arranged with Dr. Parr to meet at Chipsa Hospital and go through our catheterization today.
I'll do whatever I have to do in order to keep myself alive, because I've got too much to live for. That's not even a question in my mind.
The catheter is just a route of administration that just facilitates how easily this can go forward.
I attempted to have a catheter placed in my chest back in Delray Beach, and that was not going to be possible because they had to know why it was being placed there, what was going to be injected. And once they were to know what was going to be injected, they would not approve of it. The doctor was putting his license on the line.
The illegal therapy Gloria wants to use is a combination of sodium bicarbonate and Laetrile, also known as vitamin B17 or amygdalin. It is derived from the kernel of an apricot, and its benefits in treating cancer have been touted for generations.
There are certain places around the world that traditionally don't have cancer. In Hunza, a man's wealth was measured by the number of apricot trees he owned. They didn't have money. It's a primitive society. And they didn't have cancer either. And then you have the Vilcabambas and the Hopi and the Navajo Indians and the Aboriginal Eskimos. These little pockets, these little cultures around the world that traditionally did not have cancer. In every case, when you study the natural food of those people, it's very rich in this amygdalin substance.
Laetrile comes to prominence in the U.S. in the 1970s. It is legal in 17 states, but is easiest to find in Tijuana, Mexico, where cancer patients from all walks of life come in search of a cure.
The president had a cancer confined to the wall of his colon or bowel.
After undergoing colon surgery in 1985, President Ronald Reagan is told by his doctors that there is a chance cancer cells will spread to his liver or other organs.
In the early 80s, I was invited to train with Dr. Vera Allison in Nevada. We got a call. Secret Service said, we want you to intervene and be, by proxy, President Reagan's primary care metabolic doctor. He wants, and Nancy wants him, his wife, to use Laetrile therapy.
2 decades before Ronald Reagan is diagnosed with cancer, a future Oregon senator named Mark Hatfield meets Dr. Allison when she treats his mother for cancer using Laetrile.
Mark Hatfield never forgot that. Having befriended Reagan, obviously, he suggested, well, there's a little gal in Nevada and we need to hook you up with her. And for 13 months, we took care of President Reagan. And the way we did that, the government hired a private doctor. So each day he would hook up the IV lines according to Dr. Allison's instructions. Occasionally, President Reagan would fly to Mexico on state business. But when he was down here, he was meeting Dr. Ernesto Contreras and getting IV therapy, Laetrile. And he never had one bit of chemo or radiation. And so we had a president who lived to his 90s, used only metabolic therapy in addition to surgery, and he survived.
Laetrile, however, is not the only drug that finds its way to Mexico.
Remember what happened with tamoxifen. It was the middle 80s, late 80s. I started to use with tamoxifen, and it was not allowed in the United States. And the patients were coming to use tamoxifen here. And what we heard from doctors in the States is, oh, you are going with these quack guys that are giving you something that does not work. Who brought tamoxifen to Mexico were these pharmaceuticals. Why? Because they couldn't put it out in the States sooner. The same happened with flutamide for prostate cancer, Ulexin. It was first here in Mexico. It was not allowed in the United States. And doctors in the States says that's not a good product. Once they prove that it was an effective medicine, then they pass it out there. So alternative medicine at the end is something that perhaps the pharmaceutical needs.
This is so non-invasive and so powerful and so simple.
I would suggest that by Christmas time we're going to have a wonderful time to celebrate and be with her family and have good news and have this really, really controlled and pretty much out of her system. Let's go, girl.
Well, there are people who say patients should be able to get access to experimental drugs on demand. I have a fatal disease. I want what I want. Give it to me. I'm an American. I have the right to have that. The problem with that is we will never learn whether it worked or not if we just simply give it to anybody who wants it. We've got to make sure we understand the disease as best as we can at the molecular level, match that in a group with how the disease responds, and know whether or not we've really made any progress. The worst thing that can happen is for us to approve something that actually is worthless.
Sure, there are frauds out there, and those frauds can be identified and prosecuted, and they should be. But there are many, many brilliant doctors who provide alternatives when the FDA-approved treatment is utterly unsuccessful.
In June 2000, Jim Navarro, with the help of Congressman Dan Burton, is able to persuade Congress to hold hearings on the Thomas Navarro Patients' Rights Act, which will allow informed patients to choose their own therapy.
On behalf of the committee, I want to welcome you all here today. And Mr. Navarro, it's nice having you back with us. Why don't you tell us how your son is doing and what's transpired since we last met?
As we speak, Thomas is in therapy outside the United States, and in spite of the events of the last almost 9 months, he's doing quite well in defeating his illness.
Mr. Chairman, you asked, can an unapproved therapy believed to be less toxic be tried prior to a curative therapy that has known serious adverse events? The answer is no. The conventional therapies for medulloblastoma is one of the true success stories of pediatric oncology in that it allows a curative potential in over 75% of patients that
May I interrupt
treated.
you just real briefly? Because I saw some of the children that were cured by this treatment. I saw them. They were mentally retarded. They couldn't talk. They couldn't speak. The cancer supposedly was cured, but the child was a vegetable. Now, I'm not sure that that's what those parents envisioned when they went through the conventional treatment.
Number one, Thomas Navarro did not qualify for the protocol because it was specifically stated that patients must have had an attempted curative therapy.
Meaning chemotherapy and radiation
Chemotherapy
first.
and radiation because of the cure.
So let me.
Ignoring the requests of Chairman Burton, Dr. Pazdur refuses to listen to the testimony of other expert witnesses or Jim Navarro.
Mr. Chairman, can I just show you something really quick? What's that? As a man of common sense, I'm sure you'll agree. You've seen my son Thomas. This is his new best friend, Liam. After 2 months of chemotherapy, it triggered in him a reaction of tumors throughout his head and broke his jaw. May I show the audience? Sure. This is Thomas using alternative therapy, and this is Lim, conventional therapy, 2 months worth. Which would you choose? Who decides?
You have to admit that this is a cesspool. I mean, the FDA is not some pristine, beautiful palace where everything is crystal and everyone is spick and span. The only thing that people are allowed to see, they see a big sign, and the sign says, FDA, we defend the public health. And of all the lies that are perpetuated to the American public, that one's the biggest.
We have a serious problem in our whole federal government. It's tremendously important for the members of the Congress to be sure that they don't antagonize in any way the people who give them the money, because they need that money for their next campaign. So we have a government that is beholden primarily to the special interest money that they get from special interests and their lobbyists rather than the people of our country. And the industry that spends the most money on lobbying of any is the pharmaceutical industry. And it's money that pushes the whole system. so that it's the money that the pharmaceutical companies give in political contributions to members of Congress. And it is the movement of people from the pharmaceutical industry to the FDA and back and forth, where it's the money that these people make that moves the system. So it's not the individuals, it's the system that corrupts the whole thing.
We initially got excellent response from both sides of the aisle. But then when we introduced the bill and it went to committee, the bill was basically beat down by Henry Waxman out of LA. He was married to a sister of a former commissioner of the FDA. So you knew which side of the bread he was buttered on.
So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. No.
Just check that. Yeah, ask him to read.
Yes, he said yes. There. It's okay.
When Thomas's tumors recur in July of 2000, the Navarros have no choice but to return to the States. Thomas will undergo surgery in New York to remove the tumors, and according to standard protocol, receive 10 days of high-dose chemotherapy.
Then we had a CAT scan done on the 1st of November, and it still showed the tumor growing a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. And at this point, the tumor was getting so large that I said, you know, we just can't continue this. I was beginning to experience some pressure in my chest, and started this dry cough, and so, consequently, we started a chemotherapy program, which is the last thing I wanted to do. This mesothelioma is a very resistant cancer, and so my sense is that the Laetrile and the sodium bicarbonate were just not strong enough. And so I have no regrets, not at all.
Has it corrupted what we really want per individual patient's needs? We have to support their wishes, and we do the best we can without being dogmatic. We're learning year after year on how to integrate both safe and small doses of conventional care with maximum natural therapy approaches. Mesothelioma is really one of the hardest cancers to overcome. And so it becomes a team effort from the family's point of view and the doctor team, all that contributing to the success of this person's quality of life.
Good morning. My name is Gloria Labarge. I have a 9:45 with Dr. Costi.
It's important for us as classically trained physicians to realize the limitations of the treatments that we have and the costs in terms of side effects that they have. But it's also important for us to acknowledge that there are, for example, Chinese herbal remedies that have been around for thousands of years, and the reason that they're still used is because they have some benefit.
Oncologists throughout the country are open to prescribing alternative treatments if they can be shown to be safe and effective. But they risk losing their licenses or even being thrown in jail in the absence of data from approved clinical trials. The Office of Alternative Medicine was supposed to solve that problem.
In 1992, I was one of the few people who was asked to set up the first office of alternative medicine at the NIH. We did that with Senators Harkin and Hatch and a few others. But those dollars, the dollars that are assigned to them by way of the Senate, has to go through the approval process of the NIH.
The report language on that bill was that it was to, quote, investigate and validate alternative treatments for disease. Well, NIH would have no part of any investigation or validation of alternative treatments. And in the 8 years that I served on the advisory committee, our advisory committee was of one mind. We wanted them to do what the legislation said, investigate and validate these alternative treatments. They wouldn't do it.
It's a red-headed stepchild, and always will be.
How you doing? Good seeing you.
After being tumor-free for several months, Thomas's cancer resurfaces on his spine, and the Navarros make a last desperate plea to gain admittance to the Brzezinski Clinic.
Hi, how are you? He looks like he's feeling pretty good.
Actually, no. He's got a couple weeks.
The doctors don't even understand why he's still walking.
They don't know why he's even.
When Syracuse did an MRI on him, the doctor came out and shook his head and said, "We stopped counting tumors at 50. You need to take him home."
Or by the chemotherapy.
The tumors are being caused by the chemotherapy. Yeah, this is Chairman Burton. I need to talk to Dr. Pasteur right away. Does he have an assistant? Does the assistant have an assistant? No, I want to talk to him now. This is Chairman Burton. Can you find him?
I love this universe.
You love this universe.
You're going to be fired if I don't talk to him pretty quick, because I'll call Tommy Thompson. You want me to call the secretary? If I don't talk to him in the next 5 minutes, and you tell him I said that, I will call Tommy Thompson. Well, you get a hold of me in 5 minutes. Dang, I just get so tired of these.
Thank you so much. You take care of yourself. Yeah, my numbers are getting to normal now. They're almost back to normal. You would say it is safe to head to Houston? Because I'll put them on a jet today.
I'll get a hold of Pastor Dan and let him know, because he has no clue. Thank you so much.
Press it. Here you go.
On April 28, 2001, the Navarros' 18-month battle to get Thomas into the Brzezinski Clinic finally ends.
Okay, let's get off.
It's almost a miracle that Thomas is still alive at this moment. On the other hand, when he was waiting for FDA permission, his disease progressed, and he was very close to death.
Dr. Brzezinski said he did not hold out much hope, and but he was going to give it a try.
Hi, honey. Hi.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Hi, how are you doing?
In the spine, we see pretty much the same situation, which is good. Okay. Of course, we need to measure this exactly to find out what's the difference. We have some normal tissue which is occurring inside.
Yeah, because he turned 6 on the 5th.
The 5th of July.
Yeah, that's a big day for him.
And what day of the week is it?
It's a Thursday.
It is
beautiful.
Yes, it's Thomas's birthday.
If we would treat him 2 years ago, today he'd be cured, I believe.
A lot of people don't realize that with chemotherapy, after you're done with the treatment, the chemotherapy lies dormant in your fat cells, and then a year later reemerges. So you have that cellular breakdown all over again. You lose your hair, you have, all your organs and everything start breaking down. me to turn you, or do you want a chocolate milk?
Turn me.
Okay. Well, then be patient. I can't do two things at the same time.
Mama, turn me.
I did turn you.
No, I want this way.
You were that way, sweetie.
No, I want this way now.
Do you want to go back the other way?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You okay?
Yeah.
Alright.
You turn me.
I did turn you,
No,
sweetie.
I want this way now.
This way, right? Towards me.
Turn me up now.
I love you. You want water?
Yeah.
Statistically speaking, Ray Lamy was cured of cancer 3 times. That's because he survived 5 years past his initial diagnosis of bladder cancer in 1980, 5 years past his 1981 diagnosis of kidney cancer, and 5 years past his 2003 diagnosis of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was treated with combination chemotherapy. But he spent the last 3 years of his life battling ever more aggressive forms of the disease. And on July 21, 2009, he died from lymphoma at the age of 64. Despite vigorously pursuing treatments in both the complementary and conventional worlds of cancer therapy, Gloria Labarge succumbed to mesothelioma in July 2008.
Our oncologist conceded that the first-line treatments were no longer effective. He went to Avastin, and it really did nothing. It seemed like, the disease was bulletproof at this point. It would just be a matter of time and making her comfortable until she would pass. We didn't know how long that would be, but the disease was so intense inside of her that it turned out to be less than a month.
He was intubated like 5 times. He was put on a respirator to breathe for him. And on his 5th time, we're like, what do you want to do? Do you want to fight? Or do you want to go home? He goes, I want to go home.
In November 2001, 2 years after his diagnosis, the Navarros are told Thomas only has a few days left to live.
Do you want to go home? Yeah. Do you miss Daddy?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
You're home, baby. How you doing? Huh? You glad you're home, buddy?
Yeah.
Me too.
So then we had to make the decision to let him go. And it was very difficult. But he fought so hard. And so did we. And
his death certificate reads, respiratory arrest due to chronic toxicity of chemotherapy. That says it all.
yeah.
It says it all.
Cancer equals chemotherapy. Now, it's hard to eradicate that from your mind. So when you have a cancer, are you going to really jeopardize yourself and your mind by not taking chemotherapy? It's yourself now. You have to come in and deal with your own demons about that. It's hard to do.
1 in 2 men and 1 in every 3 women in the United States will get cancer in their lifetime. But there is hope.
What we have to do is learn how to prevent it, and we have to learn how to treat it better. Now, can we prevent it? The answer is yes. Why? Because the risk factors that we're talking about are controllable. Only 6 to 7, maybe 10% of all cancers are related to genetics.
We can't, in any individual case, be sure of preventing cancer. But But we know a lot more, and we've known a lot more for a long time about the causes of cancer.
I think there's no question that diet has something to do with cancer. There's no question. If you look at the migratory studies from, say, Japan to Hawaii to the United States and look at breast cancer, you see upticks in breast cancer, and the biggest change is the Western diet versus the Japanese diet.
Part of the problem, a big part of the problem, is the economic incentives are not there for prevention.
We are taught to treat in medical school, and we are paid to treat in practice. We don't get taught prevention, and we don't get paid to prevent. So the whole system is kind of topsy-turvy.
Prevention alone, however, will not win the war on cancer.
What are our standards for success? Does a tumor have to shrink? Well, the tumor doesn't have to shrink. In diabetes, the pancreas doesn't get better, but we treat people with insulin. And we turn a disease that would be fatal if we didn't treat it into a chronic disease. That's what we need to do with cancer perhaps first. Can we turn a tumor into just a lump?
We've had, since 1971, a very long period of time to see that the current methods of doing things are not working. Chemotherapy has long ago reached its limits. Surgery and radiation, although they become technically more refined, they only really work when you can get the tumor early and remove it, but the ancient Egyptians knew that. So you need something more effective.
The therapies which are addressing what is causing cancer, especially the changes in genetic makeup in the cancer cell, are now taking over.
We are striving toward the individualization of cancer treatment, where you would take a tumor, take an individual, characterize them molecularly, and tailor your therapy accordingly. That's not what the FDA system is built to look at. So we're going to have to step back and look at it all over again. How are we really going to characterize patients' diseases and the response to the treatments we have?
That's a big issue now. I personally think that the war on cancer would move a lot faster and would have moved a lot faster if the FDA was moving along with it instead of looking at it as sort of an adversary.
The laws aren't being made by the elected representatives. They're being made by the bureaucrats. They're insulated by law. We have to force Congress to change.
Our desire, now that we've had this time since our son's passing, and we're not whole yet, we'll never be whole, but now that we've healed to the point where we can take the hits, we want to reintroduce his bill and this time drive it through to law so that people have the right to choose their doctors.
There isn't a doctor, for example, in Italy who claims that cancer is caused by a fungus and that if you eliminate the fungus, you'll eliminate the problem. I don't know if he's right or wrong, and I don't pretend to know. But it seems to me, for God's sakes, we ought to find out, because it seems to me it's significantly important for us to find out what is the real problem here, that we should not close the door to looking at those sorts of things.
How shall we meet this challenge? How can we truly open the doors and set free the full genius of our people?
One has to assume, given the state of science and the tools we have at our disposal, there isn't anything we can't do.
Patients should have a right to choose. Doctors should be free to innovate. That's the way medicine moves forward.
If you could detach research from the financial agenda, then scientists could do their work without consideration of where this is going to lead in terms of profitability. And then I think you'd see the brilliance come out.
People say we went to the moon, and why can't we do that with cancer? And the answer is, when we went to the moon, we pretty much understood the physics and the aviation, the avionics of what it took. It was a question of whether we had the wherewithal to spend the money and put in the technology to get the man to the moon and back, which we were willing to do. We are now very early in the same process with cancer, but we're way early. We're still defining the rules of the game.
Our recovery plan will invest in electronic health records and new technology that will reduce errors, bring down costs, ensure privacy, and save lives. It will launch a new effort to conquer a disease that has touched the life of nearly every American, including me, by seeking a cure for cancer in our time.